Hey, and welcome to the Drep and Stone podcast, the podcast where two friends raise a glass and have a conversation. I'm Nick.
I'm Kyle.
Kyle.
Hey, Nick.
Hey. I am super excited this week.
Yeah, why?
I'm excited every week, like, because we're getting together, we're tasting things, we're talking about stuff, we're diving into maybe some really
interesting things.
Exactly, interesting things.
Yeah.
And this week
we're furthering our whiskey journey.
That's it.
Through investigative dramming.
Man, is that a degree? Can you get a degree in investigative dramming? That's going to be the title of my whiskey book.
Investigative dramming.
Correct.
With Drep and Stone.
Correct. Yeah, this week, Kyle, we are honored to speak with an independent bottler from Scotland.
Well, wouldn't you know? That's incredible.
In the spirit of furthering our whiskey knowledge, you see what I did there?
Yeah. Good one.
We are joined by Hannah Whiskey Merchants.
Very cool. So this is going to be like another little interview thing.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I know. Yeah.
Well, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to let you take this one solo.
Okay.
Because unfortunately, the day that we did this interview, I was doing some yard work and got stung on the face by a wasp.
You did.
Got my whole jaw swole up.
Yeah.
And couldn't make it. It was like literally like an hour before I was about to leave when this all happened.
I want to tell everybody, the good friend that I am, when I got on the phone with you and I heard you with your Marlon Brando voice.
I'm sorry, Nick, but I'm going to have to make an offer where you're going to have to do that by yourself.
That was kind of, my first inclination is like, are you okay? It was just laughing at you.
Did you just watch Godfather? Why are you talking that way?
When I got off the phone with Carol, she's like, is he okay? That's exactly
my blip.
Is he okay? I was like, I didn't ask that. I'm just laughing at him the whole time. So okay, I can take this one solo. It's not a big deal, but will you do me the honor of joining me after the conversation?
Oh yeah. I'll meet you on the back end.
Okay.
And we'll try some of these drams investigatively.
Ooh, sounds good. All right. We're honored to be joined this week by Paul and Gregor from Hannah Whiskey Merchants. Gents, how are you guys doing this week?
Yeah, all good. Busy week. Really busy time of year. So, that's exactly what we're here to do is be busy, talking whiskey, getting whiskey out there. And but all good.
Yeah, it's been not bad. We're doing a whole bunch of re-racking in the warehouse. So I'm in the warehouse right now. So there's a strong smell of wine and sherry. Pretty sure the guys have spilled quite a substantial amount of sherry on the floor. So it's going to be sticky floors for a while.
Well, it could be worse.
Yeah, I mean, the sherry that comes in these casks isn't particularly great. It's more like transit sherry, as Paul's well aware of. So it's we've had it on occasion in the past where Gavin, one of the warehouse guys, he can take a bottle of it home and he enjoys it, but even this stuff's a bit rough.
So in terms of the cask, we're just looking for the notes of the sherry. Not that this has to be anything that's super high quality. Just we need those sherry notes.
Well, it's more to do with like when we get sherry casks from Europe, what'll end up happening is they'll use good quality sherry there and then they'll rechar the casks and everything like that. But then while it's moving, to avoid having to sulfurize or use sulfur in the casks for transit, they'll maybe put some transit sherry inside the cask, keep it wet. When that stuff arrives over here, you've got like a little bit in each cask that hasn't already seeped into the oak. And that just needs poured out.
So it's just, this is a sherry that we're putting in the cask just so it can be moved, and it's not something that we have to really worry about.
Yeah, it's just transit sherry, so it's not particularly glamorous or anything like that. It's just to keep it, for want of a better word, moist on the inside.
So what we'd like to know, and I know that a lot of the Drep and Stone listeners maybe aren't as familiar with independent bottling, so we want to get into that. But before we do, what are each of your roles in Hannah Whiskey Merchants as a whole? Paul, we can start with you.
Yeah, well, on my business card it says brand ambassador, so I suppose that does take up the majority of my role. Sort of a little more public facing, doing the whiskey festivals, a little bit of travelling as well. But I suppose the most essential role that I have is sales. Essentially selling the whiskey, getting the invoices paid so that we can keep the lights on, keep our families fed, but more importantly, have money in the bank to then buy casks to keep the business going and find those gems that we are looking for that's going to make us stand out. But we are a small team, as I'm sure Gregor will allude to as well, and we all have a role to play within the business in various capacities, but can't fit them all in one business card. So brand ambassador sounds pretty good to me.
Gregor, and how about you?
So I founded the business originally, so my role's changed over the last few years, because where Paul, he does all the sort of sales stuff and goes out and does all the tastings and festivals. I'm terrible at that side of the festival side, so I'm more sourcing casks and managing the portfolio and looking after the guys in the warehouse to make sure they don't re-rack themselves into the casks and that sort of side of it. There's a lot of mundane stuff that you don't really realize, like dealing with insurance, dealing with business rates, council stuff, licenses. So yeah, the role has changed substantially since we got our own bonded warehouse, and there's a lot more of just managing that. So while Paul's out there jet setting the world and going to far-flung festivals and, I don't know, the East Nook of Fife or Aberdeen and things like that, or going to Germany, I'll pretty much encased in four walls in Dalgety Bay.
Well, there are upsides and downsides to both, whereas Paul has to, go and schmooze everyone and talk to a bunch of people. If you, Gregor, just need a day, we're like, okay, we're just going to sit in a warehouse and relax. Yeah, I guess at least you get to do that. But you mentioned the councils. That is something that we've heard from multiple people recording in a bunch of different situations and scenarios of. That is the one thing that so many consumers don't think about, the ed of, you have all of these, for those of us here in the States, whether it's a county or whether it's a municipality, a city, you have all this regulation and all these regulatory things that go into every single bottle that's made. It on one side, it sounds, a bit mundane, like you said, a bit boring, but that to me is the thing that's what drives these businesses. It's the relationships with the local councils and relationships with the local cities as well.
It's not too bad. I'm actually got a golf day tomorrow with Carntine Transport. So they transport quite a lot of bulk whiskey about Scotland. So I'm going to Crieff tomorrow, and we'll be doing a 9-hole and then an 18-hole. And usually I'm actually getting picked up, so I can have a few gin and tonics on the course. So at least I can blame that on the bad swing.
There you go. All right. So for those of our listeners who are not familiar with independent bottling, how does this all work? What is the rundown of independent bottling? Because here in the States, we have something similar, but there's some dramatic differences. So what ultimately is independent bottling? How does it work?
Independent bottling is essentially a company that's set up where we acquire casks from lots of different distilleries in Scotland, and then we'll bottle them under our own brand. So we don't own a distillery, but we do own our own bottling hall. We do own our own warehouse, and we are in control of the casks, so we can either finish them, reduce the strength, or we can bottle them whenever we choose. So that's fundamentally what an independent bottler is. There's obviously a lot more of them now than there ever has been. There's a growing trend in the United States for a couple independent bottling companies. I think Lost Lanterns is a really popular one. So I don't know, we were actually in a independent bottler of the year competition with them, and they did really well out of that. So yeah, I think there's obviously bonders in Ireland, and there's English independent bottlers as well. So yeah, it's a really thriving industry. I don't think the barriers to entry are particularly high, or not as high as what they used to be. And there's a lot more available access to spirit as well.
Yeah, it seems like here in the States anyway, our version of independent bottlers are less distillery specific and more going to, I don't know if you're familiar with Midwestern Grain Products, MGP, which is a massive distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And they're a contract distillery. Whereas it seems to be the moving into, contacting a distillery here in the States and then trying to bottle from that distillery is far less of a pursuit than it is in Scotland or in Ireland, in England as well. And so I'm just interested in, is it because in terms of Scotch, and maybe you can speak to Irish whiskey as well a little bit, but is it just, dare I say, it's not as precious? Like there's not the distillery just wants to get product out. I mean, that's ultimately how they're making money. So for them, it's not, we have to bottle under our own lines. It's, we just want to get casks out. We want to get liquid to consumers in any way we can.
So in Scotland and the UK, that you are able to contract distill. People are more aware of it when it comes to gin, but it is possible to acquire stock from distillers. It's just, it's quite rare, and usually those sort of contracts are kept quite confidential. But people have got, and a lot of independent bottlers have got trade contracts with a lot of distillers to acquire a certain amount of stock, either at a new spirit stage or, you know, at younger stages. And the independent bottler is obliged to take that stock on a yearly or quarterly basis. So it's not really that different, I guess. It's quite an old tradition as well. And there's a lot of different reasons why distillers will sell stock, whether that is for a cash injection, whether that is to trade stock for the purposes of acquiring stock for their own blends. You'll find that a lot of distillers and distilling companies have got blends in addition to their single malt brands. So it's inevitable that some parcels of their own stock will end up on a market.
So in some cases, it's a matter of, we've produced X amount of barrels of this particular distillate, and we either don't have room, or we have this contract with an independent bottler, and we want to obviously distill more, so we have to get it out to people like yourselves, I'm assuming. And then what an independent bottler does is then puts it in another cask or ages it in their own warehouse. So what is that process like? Like once you've acquired the barrel of whiskey, the cask of whiskey, is it now I have to do something different with it? Or is it I could leave it in its own cask and now I'm just holding on to it?
It depends the reason that you've acquired the stock. There's a lot of companies that have acquired stock for the purposes that it has to get sold back to the distiller in the future, so they'll maybe just sit on it. If we've acquired stock from a distiller, usually it will be for the purposes that we have to use that in our own brands. That's part of the contract. So in order to increase the value of that stock, or to add value to the stock, which is probably a better description, we'll maybe re-rack that, because a lot of the stock, when it comes from the distiller, this has maybe been earmarked for blending.
Right.
It doesn't fit a recipe, or they're looking to get rid of stock which they no longer require for whatever reason. Maybe they've had it set aside for a blend that no longer gets sold in a specific market, and they'll just want to liquidate that asset. Or like you've alluded to before, there's maybe a surplus and they're wanting to just capitalize on that.
And so that's where the independent bottler comes in, of now I can obviously take that and then bottle it under my own label, my own bottling, and possibly, as you mentioned, create a new blend or a new whiskey entirely by aging it in, as you mentioned at the top of the episode, a port barrel or an Armagnac barrel or whatever it is.
Yeah. Generally, there'll be quite a lot of re-racking in independent bottling, but that's not to say it's the only thing that happens.
Right.
When we do our releases, we try and create a broad spectrum of single cask releases when we do our quarterly outruns. So that means that we'll maybe have a cask or two which has been finished or re-racked a number of years ago, and we'll also have bourbon barrels or refill hogsheads which have just been fully matured in that, and that gives you a really good idea of the distillate character. Right. Which we're finding is becoming more sought after than like a huge finish, which overpowers the distillate.
Right. I think what makes me so interested in independent bottlers as a whole is the role that independent bottlers play within this just massive whiskey and spirits industry. Whether it's, again, experimentation with other re-racks, or, we're taking these casks, we're aging them in order to help someone else. So what do you guys see, kind of in that same vein of what we were discussing, the role of the independent bottler in terms of this just massive spirits and whiskey industry as a whole?
mean, we're independent bottling is a tiny niche within an industry, so tends to be that when I first got a deal sorted with one of the larger distillers, the reason they were inclined to sell stock to myself was because independent bottling increases the category. So what that's to mean is that if they're doing like a standard, I don't know, Kalila or something like that, or a Lagavulin or anything Dalyuan, the benefit that they have of releasing multiple versions of those casks to multiple independent bottlers is all those independents will do different things and they'll sell them in different markets, and it will generally just increase that sort of the single malts awareness, really.
Can I jump in as well? I think Gregor's really covered that well in terms of the modern role of independent bottlers, but I think I'm certainly always keen to remind people that independent bottlers were the foundation of the whisky industry as to what it is today. You know, even Johnny Walker, which is the biggest selling Scotch whisky in the world, at one point was an independent bottler, a grocer, you know, buying casks from distillers who were farmers. Farmers made beer, they made whiskey in the winter, and they had no interest in selling it. And it's really just, you know, the 60s, the 70s, when distillers turned around and said, hang on a minute, we'll start bottling and selling this ourselves. Now, obviously oversimplifying that there, but essentially that's where it came, because before that you had bars, shops, grocers, like I mentioned, going to distilleries, buying their whiskey and taking it back to their place and putting their name on it. And that's essentially what we are still doing today. But as Gregor mentioned, we have to find a different way of doing that, because with all the best will in the world and the deepest pockets you can have, you can't just drive up to a distillery these days and fill your van with whatever casks they've got available. It's a bit different.
They tend to frown on that.
Days, but I still think we fly the flag for the purist. That's our role. The whiskey geek, the whiskey enthusiast, and not that there's never going to not be a place for Johnny Walker Red Label or Glenfiddich 12-year-old. Absolutely require them. The success of those whiskies is what allows us to do our thing. What we at now, Gregor? Close to 150 malt distilleries in Scotland now. So if it wasn't for the success of these blends, we would not have the variety, and it's variety that we live and die by. We could not do our thing without the variety of distillates, different styles to work with. Because if there only was a handful of distilleries, then there wouldn't even be independent bottling out there. So it gives us the freedom to do that as well these days. And as we've mentioned before about the initiative, the license to be creative with the casks, with the port casks, the sherry casks, or just those decisions that define the rest of the journey of that whiskey is what we can take ownership of. Can't take the blame for how bad the spirit is distilled, but we can certainly take the credit for how it's finished.
So here in the States, if you are a company that you're contracting or you're buying casks from other places, you have to disclose in some way. And in most places, it's minimal. It's just like here, it was distilled in this location. Is there any sort of regulations in Scotland where you have to disclose this particular original distillate is from this distillery, or is it now that we own the cask, we own the liquid, we can label it as something else?
I mean, ultimately, I think it boils down to the paperwork that comes with the cask, because it's not quite as black and white as what you mentioned. I think it would be nice if it was a little bit more black and white, but
I'm sure.
For example, we can put the name of the distillery on the bottle for the vast majority of the casks we own, but there is a handful of distilleries where, for whatever reason, they want to protect their own brand or their own name. So therefore we can't name that. But it all comes down to where you're sourcing the cask from as well. But I don't know if Gregor wants to open this can of worms, the provenance and all that we're talking about just now, that might come in with the new potential new regulations that might change things a little bit. So
no.
Yeah, how much trouble do you want to get in?
There's quite a lot happening at the moment within the SWA and the EU, and there's a whole thing happening with regards to naming where a cask comes from. At the moment, it's we can name and put the name of where the spirit's from. But I mean, we just did a cask there, which was we called it an Orkney malt, and that was part of the requirement. We couldn't name what distillery it was from, but there's only 2 distilleries on Orkney, so no, I just don't want to bore people. To be honest, that side of it, I find, because there's a lot of legislation when it comes to that, and we could go on for hours about teaspooning whiskey, and then people just not having to use certain names or avoiding certain brands. I just feel like a lot of people are just listen to that and be like, they'll start going cross-eyed.
Because ultimately, I mean, and I think to some degree you're correct. Most people, it doesn't interest them. You know, they're interested in the liquid, they're interested in the bottling, they're interested in the story behind that. But at the end of the day, the legislation is, Gregor, something that you deal with. And, you know, for I guess the average consumer is like, cool, that stuff's great, but I care about the liquid, and that's ultimately what I love.
Yeah, I mean, if every consumer cared about the liquid, I think it would be absolutely great, because then you wouldn't have to worry about the labeling. You could just put the best spirit in the bottle. But there's certain casks that we just can't touch because it's, for whatever reason, it's teaspooned. And whether teaspooning actually exists, it's another question, but it certainly exists on the paperwork, and the cask will come in as a blend. And then we can't really use that because we can't describe where it's come from, because we're limited by our own personal label requirements. That's not to say other independent bottlers don't have a route to market with the way that they label it, but I find that teaspooned spirit is just not worth the hassle. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
I can explain what teaspooning is if anyone wants to know. I'll talk about all this stuff all night. I'm a proper whiskey geek, so just let me know if you just want to. Take on that.
Keep going.
It's not a weekend activity, although that, you know, I'm more into full dessert spoons rather than teaspoons. But anyway, that's a different story, and it's not past your watershed yet over the other side of the pond, so we'll not go there. But no, I think it boils down to once upon a time, distillers were selling casks by the 100 to other companies for blending. Is something that the Scotch whisky industry is famous for. You have all these, even though competing companies, multinational businesses with huge brands and spending millions on marketing, will still trade with other companies. But just to be sure, and to make sure that the integrity of each whisky was maintained, they would, in theory, and as that's what Gregor alluded to, you know, whether they actually do it or not, but they would open each cask and put a tiny little teaspoon amount of something else in there, therefore creating a blended malt rather than a single malt. So, you know, so little that it doesn't affect the the spirit character, but enough that it can't be called a single malt anymore and has to be called a blended malt. So it's a whole, you know, can of worms. We've used that description before, but it certainly is. But, you know, these casks still exist. Whether or not they actually do it is a debatable question, but ultimately we're led by the paperwork, and if it comes in and it says it's a blended malt, then we can't put the word single malt on that label or else.
And do you find that because you can't put that on the label that people are a little more reticent to then like engage in whatever product you have, or is it just because it's labeled single malt, that's the thing that people are looking for specifically?
Well, I think ultimately, we live in a world still where if you can name the distillery, the entire provenance of that whiskey is clear as a whistle. So it's yes, you have intrigue. You know, there is trade names out there for certain malts that have been blended that we sometimes can use and sometimes we can't use, and there's a little cheat codes on the internet that you can find out which distillery that's from, potentially which teaspoon whiskey has been put in there. And yeah, it creates a little bit of a mystery. But ultimately, you know, it helps us the more information we can provide. You know, the provenance is a word I'll use. You know, if we can name that distillery, then it will sell. It will move quicker, more likely than if we can't, no matter what crazy name it has on there, even if it's one of the more common ones. But yeah, it kind of boils down to that.
Gregor, I have a question for you. I know that you're kind of the master behind all of the casks, if you will. How do you what is your barrel selecting, your re-rack selecting? What is the philosophy there? What is your process? How do you kind of see all of this?
To be honest, Paul and I work together when it comes to cask selection. We've got a portfolio of about 400 casks that we add to every year, which we take out of every year. And really, when we're looking at an outrun, we've got some guiding principles in terms of what we're looking for. So we'll do 6 casks or 7 casks per outrun, and we'll do 4 outruns a year. And within that outrun, we'll look for a cask which is maybe got quite a good or quite a high cask influence. We'll look for something that's quite aged. We'll want something that's like a lower cost for the consumer. And within that, we'll always look within each release to get a good balance of distillate character and the cask. And we'll look to get a spread of different ages. So you'll want maybe 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old, 25-year-old. Then the reason we do that is so that when we put our price list together and we send it out to our importers, there's a very varied list that they can then take to their shops and their retailers, and you've got a broad range, so something for everyone. So within that, Paul and I both really enjoy our whiskies. Paul's probably got his favourites and I've got mine, but generally we can understand what's good quality spirit, and ultimately that's what we look for, is a good balance and good quality spirit. A lot of the selections that we do, bearing in mind, we're not producing Johnny Walker Black Label. It's not the same thing every single time. Each cask has got a unique and different taste. That's why they're great for like whiskey tastings, where you can try like 5 or 6 drams, and they'll all take you to different places in terms of flavor and palate.
So how does that process work? Do you, is it these casks are earmarked from this distillery for independent bottlers, or is it you're wandering through warehouses, kicking cask and going, that sounds great, let's try that one, and then thieving a little bit and like, oh yeah, this one's great, can we buy this one?
So the way it works is I would have acquired parcels of stock from a distiller a number of years ago, and you would buy it in ages between like 3 and 7 years old. So you'd get the parcel of stock in. Generally, you'd try the casks, and they'd probably be in varying levels of quality. And then you'd put together a re-rack program, which would involve either sourcing casks from France, where we tend to get a lot of casks, or sourcing them from Portugal. We'd bring them here, we'd re-rack those casks, and then we'd just wait for them to improve. Now, if you imagine I've done that about 7 years, because the business started in 2012. That means you've got a portfolio now of, say, maybe 200 casks that you can select from, and they've all been re-racked and they're all maturing at a really good rate. And so you'll just be able to cherry pick. One of the rules that we have is that we don't release from the same distillery every 12 months. So we only release one, like Glen Elgin, a year, or one Tininique a year. So that's challenging for us as Scottish independent bottlers, because we've got 150 distilleries to pick from, and I think
and that's a self-imposed rule. That's a rule that you guys are like, this is what we want to do.
That's what we want to do. We want to create variety. But to put it into context, we've got 150 distilleries, and in the US, I think you've got 2,751. So if you had an independent bottler there, you'd have a lot more casks to pick from.
So then for you guys, it's we want variety. That's what you guys want. We want variety. We want to create a profile that allows us to hit a bunch of different flavor profiles, a bunch of different ages. And to me, that's really interesting, because it also kind of aligns with what we see more here in the States of also experimentation. I think that bourbon, specifically American whiskey, and even more specifically bourbon, is so rigid in that it must be this. And I know that there are, a lot of rulings and laws and legalese surrounding Scotch as well, but it seems that Scotch is far more willing to broaden that perspective of, here is a 15-year, whatever. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to put it and re-rack it into an Armagnac cask for another year. let's see what that does. Oh, wow, this is phenomenal. Or maybe it needs another year. So then you guys as independent bottlers can then choose, you know what, that one does need another year and a half. Let's come back to it, see where we are. And that to me is so interesting that whiskey in the UK, whiskey specifically in Scotland, is willing to do that and experiment.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier on that's our license to do that, and I think that's what sets other independent bottlers and compared to us apart. We can't control that distillation process, but if Gregor was buying casks, 7-8 years ago, it's the decisions that he made and we now make together that kind of define the rest of the journey of that whiskey and essentially define us as an independent bottler. Because as you mentioned, we could put that 15-year-old, Glen whatever into an Armagnac cask, but another independent bottler might also taste that same cask but say, oh no, we think this should go into sherry, and so therefore that's those decisions. Right. But it's not just obviously that secondary cask that you're looking to decide on, it's how long it's in there, how much effect will that contribute to the original flavour, spirit, character of that whiskey. And for us, it's something that's really, really important, is finding that balance between the spirit character and the choices that we make after we take ownership of the cask and the influence of the oak on that spirit. Now, balance is key for us. That sometimes means that we'll put it into a sherry cask and it doesn't have to be the colour of Guinness by the time it comes back out, because therefore the oak is taken over a lot. But for another independent bottler, and there is a few, and I'm not going to name names, that is their priority, is to get the whiskey as dark as possible, right, and to get it easier to sell, because darker is easier to sell, is more desirable. As we mentioned at the beginning, actually, it seemed to be coming back around. There's a few more markets for purists out there, which is fantastic, because that's, I think, lost a little bit these days with the aggressive sherry casks we have. But yeah, so much more to it than just picking a cask. It's a lot of decisions that need to be made, and even the time that you choose to mature that whiskey, whether it be in its original cask, whether it be into a sherry or a port or Armagnac, all these decisions which are crucial to that whiskey and crucial to your reputation as an independent bottler.
Yeah, and I think too, Paul, you just mentioned something that I find over and over again, we have these conversations surrounding age, and so many consumers are just obsessed with age. They assume that if this whiskey is 15 years, if this whiskey is 25 years, that automatically makes that product substantially better. And I think something that we've done across the last almost 300 episodes, or I think by the time this releases over 300 episodes, is that age and color does not automatically make the best whiskey. It's so many different nuanced aspects that go into this. That's what makes a great whiskey. And that ultimately, I think in some aspects, is that's where the trust of the independent bottler comes in. The trust of the consumer for the independent bottler is, you've priced this at X amount of dollars or pounds or whatever it is that, the country that you're selling. And I trust that your tastes as the people who are creating these specific bottlings create a great ultimate dram. And that's what I think that, at least from my perspective, the independent bottler, that's the kind of the charge of the independent bottler is doing just that. Is finding those things that, like, man, sure, this is a 7-year whatever, but this cask, or now that we've re-racked it into something else, this is where the whiskey truly shines.
Yeah, 100%. See, everything you've just said there, see if you could put that on a back label of a bottle, we could just have that right now. But no,
you're welcome to use it. I'll send it to you. You're welcome to use that.
No, absolutely fantastic. I think the point about colour and age, that goes back to a few brands and lots of marketing back in the 70s and the 80s, where they were selling the whiskey but presuming that it's better because it was darker equals older is better, and we still live with that today. It is a fact that it's much easier to sell a whiskey that's 20 years old versus 10 years old. Of course, it's more expensive, but it's not always the case. And again, I'm always going to come back to it. And I do apologise to anyone who's on a tasting with me that I use the word balance so many times, because it's so crucial and so true. And know that balance can be achieved at 15 years old, but it can also be achieved at 7 years old or 27 years old. It all depends on, all the little parts that come together with that whiskey, the spirit style, the cask that it's been maturing in. And there's a lot of whiskies out there that demand a very aggressive maturation, some very robust spirits that you maybe wouldn't want to drink too young, but then they mature into this wonderful, butterfly once it gets a little bit older in the right cask. So it's not as straightforward. And the more people who can find that, if you ask someone who works at a distillery making the whiskey every day, and they make the whiskey, and ask them what they would choose to drink, it would be something younger. It would be something that has that profile of the whiskey that they're making, not something that's saturated in oak. As wonderful and complex as an old whiskey can be, that wouldn't be the whiskey that they would want to drink. And do you know what? If they say that, those words carry a lot of weight. So, but yeah, like I said, it's all about finding that right balance, and that's subjective to us. It's our choices. We live and die by those choices. But each whiskey to its own, and that's the beauty of Lady of the Glen, our core brand as well. Single cask whiskies from one cask strength. It's about identifying those little nuances within each cask that stand out. And I mentioned about some whiskies, as in some distilleries work better younger, some work better older, but that can boil down to the individual cask as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people don't understand too, is it's not just age. It's, okay, so here's a 15-year distillate, but instead of putting it at cask strength, maybe we put it at 95 ABV. Well, why'd you do that? Because that's where the distillate truly sings. That's where that symphony of all those flavors and everything is just perfect. And I think, again, that goes back to the trust of the independent bottler, whether you are doing things at cask strength like Lady of the Glen, or you are doing things where let's tune that down just a little bit. But that's the beautiful spot. Something too, Paul, you mentioned when touring Scotland and a bunch of distilleries, and then a bunch of distilleries here in the States, something that I'm always taken aback by is how much people that work in the distilleries love the new make. I mean, we know that obviously with age and with time in a barrel comes a bunch of different complexities, but when you have a distillery and a distillery manager or the people that are working lines and different things, when they love the new make, that to me, that's where the special magic happens. It's this is our distillate. This is what we love. And then now we age it in a cask for 7, 8, 30 years, and it just becomes that much more special.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can totally understand that the folk who make the whiskey, that's the part. And again, I touched on it before, that they can control that aspect. Once the whiskey's in, or the spirit's in the cask, it's up to a little bit of magic, a little bit of science, and everything in between to make that final product. Yeah, you can control as much as you can, but there's, and I think to just explain further the point I made about single casks, it's known that you could have two casks, and we've had it in our warehouse as well, two sister casks that were produced at the same time, filled into the same type of cask on the same day, same type of wood, matured next to each other for all their life, and you could pour a glass of each of those, and they could be completely different whiskies in there. And as I said, there's a bit of magic goes on. Science can explain most of it, but I turn a little bit of a blind eye to that, because there's something magical about it that we just like the thought of. That you can't explain that, but we don't care. We just want to pick the best one out of those two casks. And again, that's our decision to make what one we think's the best and try and capture that moment in the bottle.
Let's be honest. The science is one thing, but we'll keep it in magic, because that's such a better story. We saw a video about the St. Bridget's Kirk, the Solera system that you guys have. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the Solera system is what we use for one of our blends, which is called St. Bridget's Kirk, which is named after a local landmark. It's a separate brand from Lady of the Glen, which is single cask. So St. Bridget's Kirk is a blend, and we've got 3 variants under it. We've got a red label, a blue label, and a tawny label. And the red label is a blend that includes components that are grain and malt. The blue label is just blended malt. And the tawny label is the Solera system. So to give you an idea, Solera system was taken from Spain, and it's used for when they're creating like their sherries. So they'll stack all their casks in big, huge triangles, and they've got various ways in which the wine goes through each of the casks, whether it's through pipes or whether it's manually sort of tipped in. But the whole purpose of it is to create a consistent product. So you find that it's really popular with certain sherry houses, and they'll have Solera systems that are decades old. And you'll also find that a lot of Scottish whisky companies, especially big distillers, will pay a lot of money for these old Solera systems because they can use these casks that have contained sherry in them for like decades. So there's lots of flavour in that. So what we created in our warehouse was a 3-cask Solera system, and the casks are connected by copper pipes. So originally when I had the idea to do this Solera system, I contacted a local cooperage and advised them what I wanted to do. And I kind of thought that they would send me this pyramid of casks and it'd be done. But what they actually did is they just sent me 3 casks. And so I had to get the guys in the warehouse, Alex and Gavin, but it was mainly Alex with this. They used like a drill bit and drilled a hole in the casks, and then they created they filled it in with copper pipes. So what happens is we've got 3 casks that are in a pyramid. Each cask is about 120 litres capacity, and we bottle about 100 or so bottles from the system, and then we tip in the blend or our homemade blend into the top cask, and then we wait 6 months, and then we draw again from the bottom right-hand cask. So the original blend that goes into the system is a result of years of re-racking. And what would happen is that every time you re-rack a standard cask of 200, which is about 250 litres, into a wine barrique, which is maybe 200, you'd have leftover spirit. So whenever I would do a re-racking, I'd just take all the leftover spirits and just stick them in a hogshead. So this was really, we had quite a few of these hogsheads that contained this blend, and we brought it into the warehouse to sample it, and we tried it, and it was really rough. Like, because it was going into really knackered hogsheads, because it was just pretty tired oak. It was oxidizing really well, and it was maturing in that sense well, but the oak wasn't giving it any sort of flavor. The actual spirit had married together well, but yeah, there was no oak character. So it felt like, well, a Solera system would be a really innovative and interesting way to create a sort of consistent product. I mean, it's really variable batch to batch. Each batch seems to get better than the last because each batch is spending longer in the system. And yeah, I mean, it goes in and it's pretty clear. There's not a lot of color in it, and then it comes out, and yeah, it's a tawny color. So yeah, there's obviously a lot of wood impact.
That's so cool. So then each run you do of it is then just going to add to the complexity as it keeps going.
100%. So what adds to it is that the actual construction of the system is that the top cask that all the spirit goes into first is a Fino sherry. So that has a bit of a lighter brine quality to it, and then the spirit passes through 2 Oloroso sherries. So then you're getting the classic rich fruitcake. You're getting a double whammy of that before it gets bottled.
That's so cool. And I wish that more, at least here in the States, more people, and I know that people are doing something similar, but more people would do that. More distilleries would just, let's see what we can do. I mean, like you said, it could be initially something that's a little bit of a rough go, but as we do this more and more, it's going to be, we're going to get some interesting things out of this.
Yeah, I think the initial batches for it were, it's surprising because obviously the initial batches are still really strong because the casks themselves are really fresh. So the initial runs, you're getting a lot of sherry influence, but then the later batches, you're getting an equally good spirit, but it's a bit better because the spirit has had a bit more time to marry. It's had a bit more, just a gradual maturation. An important point to note, though, is that there's no age statement, because as soon as the spirit goes into the Solera system, because there's an element of copper in the system, technically there's no further aging. So the spirit will only be as old as what it was when it was in the original blend cask, which is about 7 or 6 years old.
Yeah, I think the powers that be, the Scotch Whisky Association, were nervous to say the least when we presented the idea of this, and quite rightly so, because it does fling up a lot of red flags in terms of what they want to look for or not look for. Gregor mentioned the copper pipes, so anything that protrudes or intervenes into the cask other than just the oak that it's made from itself is a big no-no. And also, I think the thing that made them very nervous was the idea of us topping it up, so adding whiskey in there, and the age statement wouldn't have worked because we're topping up, but also we're sort of bastardizing the maturation, if you like, by having the copper pipes in there and flushing it through. But there's times where forgiveness is better than permission, and there's other times where permission is better than forgiveness. So I'll let you use your imagination which one worked best for us here. But I think that the age concept, we kind of get around that a little bit because we can talk about it. We can't put it on the label. But I always like to think that we have sherry casks in this Solera system that are quite active. We obviously have time passing, and I don't know about you, but I don't have a button that can stop time. So yeah, the whiskey's not aging in those casks, but it's still maturing. I'm going to get shot for saying that, but anyway. It's not like this goes out to the rest of the world or anything, so it's fine.
But I mean, let's be honest. Anyone who spent any time around whiskey at all, once you start kind of delving into that, like, wait, this was in a such and such cask, and then it was aged another 3 maybe years in another cask. So it went from 10 years to 13 years, but on the bottle, they're calling it 10. And I think it all comes down to, and I understand the SWA, and I understand all of the, the legal aspects, trying to protect what Scotch whiskey is, or trying to protect what bourbon or American or Tennessee whiskey. I understand all of that, but ultimately we can all look at that bottle and go, okay, so it's a 10-year in this cask, but then we aged it another year, or we ran it through the Solera system, and now it's actually this. Okay, we see what's going on here.
Yeah, a little bit. And we can only put so much of that detail on the label and try and let people use their creative imagination and a little bit with initiative on that. But certainly when we get the chance, or if I get the chance to present that whiskey to any kind of audience, then I fill in all the gaps that we can't put on the label. And yeah, there is a little bit to be left to the imagination. And the whole idea of creating the batch process was that, and Gregor might have said already, but we had at least 7 hogsheads worth of this identical blended malt, which was, not bad. It was certainly a good base to do something interesting with, but far too much of the same liquid for a small independent bottler like ourselves. So the Solera system, I can't actually even remember what my reaction was when I came in the day that Gregor mentioned that he'd bought a Solera system from the cooperage, and that we were going to put this blend in there. I don't think it would have been a very positive reaction, but you know what? I'm a humble guy, because the final product that we are now seeing coming out of that little spigot tap at the bottom right is absolutely fantastic. And it's so, I mentioned before, I'm a whiskey geek before it's my job, and it enhances my job and what I can do within the job. But it's little moments like this that remind me exactly why I'm in this industry and why I enjoy working with an independent bottler, because we can do these things, creative license. Here we have, something that we've made, something pretty ordinary that we've made very special, and I get to share that with people. We get to share that with people, and show that what can be done within the rules. bending the rules, to create something that's a bit of fun. So yeah, if anyone's got hold of any of the batches, I do encourage you to go out and try any other batches you can find, just to see the difference that this is making. And you can take my word for it; it really is changing every 6 months that we bottle. And we actually had a little taste of what will be batch 5 just a couple of months ago there, and it's really knocking it out of the park now. Almost to the point where we slightly regret bottling batch 1, 2, 3, and 4 as soon as we did. But it's the whole idea that the whiskey's flowing through this Solera, and the magic with the Solera is that there's always a little bit of the previous liquid left in the cask before. It flushes through, but not every drop goes through. So there's some that remain, and it gets mixed in. So, you have this magic. We used the word magic before in the description. This is certainly magic that's happening now. And I think it's that, that marriage of that spirit that we continually top up versus what's been remained in there for over 2 years now, probably 2.5 years now. And it's that's coming through and working magic. So yeah, keep an eye out for the future batches. There's not too many left. I think we're already halfway through it. So
yeah, I think, Paul, for us, when we talk to listeners, when we talk, we get independent bottlings in, like the ones that we've tasted in this episode. For us, people ask us, why should I care? Why should I do this? And why should I be drawn to independent bottlers? And I think everything you just said is the reason why. Not only because, first of all, here's something that we did first run, and yes, it was we stand behind it, but now that we're X number of runs into it, here's something that is different. And I think that people, especially whiskey nerds like ourselves, when you get that first bottling, oh, here's something interesting, and then you get the fourth bottling, and 2, 3, and then you get the 8th bottling, and you get all the ones in between, then you can start to parse out all the differences. And I think that that's what makes this idea so enticing to myself and other whiskey nerds. It's I want to see those variations, and I want to can I pick out those variations, and what does this process ultimately impart for the whiskey as a whole?
Yeah, 100%. And the best thing about it is it's not expensive.
Exactly.
We created this product. We wanted people to follow the batches, but we literally had these casks of what were remnants, so we made the most of it, and we tried to get the whiskey out there at such an achievable price, and so that people can follow it. And do you know what? I often have one of our Solera, St Bridget's Kirks, on a tasting or a whiskey festival on the lineup, and I'm not ever going to try and say that it's going to be the best whiskey in the lineup. It's far from the best whiskey in the lineup, but I guarantee it will be the best bang for buck whiskey that you will try in a long time. And you know what? It's got a smoky character to it as well. So if you don't like it, just chuck it on the barbecue. It's amazing barbecue sauce as well.
We have a couple last questions for you guys, and the first is just from our perspective, from my perspective. I'm super excited to see that you guys that your products are available here in the U.S. for a number of reasons. Not only because from what I've had, it's fantastic, but also because I want the whiskey consumer. We want the whiskey consumer here in America to be exposed to things outside of that narrow bourbon line. And that's obviously, that is the American spirit bourbon, but there are so many really beautiful, interesting things coming out of independent bottlers as a whole that I'd like to see more people experiment. So I'm super excited that you guys are breaking into the U.S. or have broken into the U.S. So what sparked that push to break out of Scotland?
We've actually been in the US market for a number of years now, in and out. It seems to be we'd take a hiatus and then we get back in. We're working with an importer now called Saks Dynamics, and they're working really hard to get us in a lot more shops. But as a small business in Scotland, and particularly in the Scotch whisky industry, we're always looking to export our product abroad. That's how we grow. The UK market's it's really competitive, but it's also, to an extent, it's really really full. And as a Scotch product, you need to be looking to other countries. And the US has always been an important market for Scotch, as you'll be aware. It's destined to be even more important in the number of years. It's already got a palate for distilled spirit. It's English speaking in the majority of the time. So I think it's natural that we'd want to be in the US. I know Paul's really keen to come over and do tastings at some point. So the more we grow, probably the more that Paul can come over and, I can get some peace here and actually get some stuff done without Paul having to take cask samples every couple of days from the same casks.
Only the good casks.
Paul, in that respect, you're welcome to come over and meet with us anytime you'd like. And especially if Gregor's paying for the flight, you're welcome to come over.
That's the conversation. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean it's a chicken and egg, I suppose, isn't it? It's about finding the market and then finding the justification to come over. Yeah, it's just finding that right balance. But yeah, absolutely would love to come over. Meet you guys in person, put a kind of a face to the name of the business as well as myself, and just spread the word. Our importers, our distributors around the world do a fantastic job. We can communicate to them all the information we can, but then we rely on them taking that information and being the brand ambassador when I'm not there. So it's working with these partners that gives us that ability to be that person on the ground as well. And so that's important to us. But yeah, you can't beat getting out on foot on the ground as well. So hopefully soon. That would be very nice.
Yeah. Well, this whole conversation is proof positive of, Gregor, you mentioned Sachs Dynamics, and Howard has been such a good contact for us, a good friend for us to meet people like yourselves, but also just getting the word out about amazing products. And I think that here in the States, especially with our just interesting 3-tiered system, that the importer plays such a crucial role. And when you have someone who's willing to, Paul, as you just mentioned, be the spokesperson when someone from the distillery or the bottling or the independent bottler can't be there. I think that is so important.
Yeah, I mean, Howard's obviously popped over a number of times, and Howard's got quite a lot of expertise. He already owns casks, so I've been really enthusiastic and really supportive with our products and our brands. We're keen to operate in the US, and we're keen to support Howard and Melissa in any way we can.
All right, final question for you guys. What excites you most about the future of Hannah Whiskey Merchants and independent bottlers as a whole? Gregor, we can start with you.
It's a big question. It's a really competitive market at the moment. The things that get me excited about independent bottling are when we're able to release casks that we haven't done before, such as we've just done a Pulteney. We've got a Glen Scotia coming out at some point. We're also doing a limited release of a Samhain series, which is like a Halloween series of releases that we do. And we're working with a local artist called Stephen Shand.
That's cool.
So we're picking through some Scottish folklore stories located near specific distilleries that we're releasing. So that's what gets me excited, because if I'm being brutally honest, I don't really think there is a lot of room for innovation in independent bottling. I think innovation sort of exists in more the distilling side and how you can work with fermentation. I think it's naive to assume that independent bottling's got much room for innovation when the types of casks you can use are quite fixed. They have to be oak. They have to be. You can't have stone fruit and things like that. And I actually agree with Angus McElraith when he says that if you're using casks like tequila and things like that, how much of that is actually a gimmick, and is it actually for the benefit of the spirit? So I do feel like we've sort of hitting our peak in terms of what's the best casks and identifying what the best casks are for re-racking. And then at the end of the day, I've got a lot of time for just well-matured stock and refill hogsheads on bourbon barrels. So yeah, that's my answer in a nutshell, I guess.
Great. Paul, how about you? What excites you most about the future of Hannah Whiskey Merchants and independent bottlers as a whole?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of what an independent bottler is more things like this to get that message out. I think especially in younger markets, and I suppose you couldn't really count the US as a younger market, but it still is led by brands. But it's about sharing that message and showing what we can do within the product we've got, but it's getting that message across. But for me, I just think it's really exciting what can be done within the realms of what you can do with an independent bottler. Sourcing casks from well-known distilleries and putting your stamp on them, and owning that, and that's again go back to the point I was saying earlier on about that control that you can have and proudly put your brand name and stand behind that product. Now I get very excited about that anyway, but it's also about the unknown distilleries that we get in abundance. The ones that most of it goes into blends. Not as easy to sell because people buy based on the name of the distillery as much as the quality of the whiskey, but it's about showcasing these distilleries that no one's heard of, and there's nothing better than seeing people change their mind about distilleries that they have never heard of. I'm so lucky that when I joined the business 5 years ago, Gregor had already put into place a wonderful program of buying casks and re-racking casks, which we really are seeing the fruits of those right now. Some of the stock that we're bringing up to our own warehouse that's been maturing in situ in a third-party warehouse that was re-racked maybe 6-7 years ago, the quality of that liquid is just absolutely phenomenal. 7 years is not a long time, but it is a long time for a small company like ourselves that's only been going since 2012. So I say credit to Gregor for putting those foundations in place. And so that has continued, and we touched on it earlier on. The guys in the warehouse today, spilling transport sherry all over the floor, so the floor's going to be sticky for the next week. But it's that work. It's that work that will pay off in 3, 4, 5 years' time, and we know that some of the whiskies that are getting re-racked today will be phenomenal when they come to their peak in the years to come. So that's the work that we are doing today for the future. And so it's those things that we're really excited about. And the whisky industry just now is in a little bit of a plateau. There's a lot of people saying that it's on a decline. It's not on a decline. It's on a plateau. It's stopped growing because it really grew so fast after COVID, and it has slowed down a little bit. But what that's meant for independent bottlers is we are just about starting to see the door open a little bit for better availability of casks from well-known distilleries, but some distilleries that we haven't seen so often in the past. We mentioned before we had just bottled our very first ever cask from Pulteney in the latest release, which is really exciting. Again, the whiskey nerd, the whiskey geek in me loves the idea of that, and of course Gregor, his business, his baby, getting to tick off another distillery off of the list of ones we haven't bottled before. So the idea of getting more of those casks, and just prices coming down a little bit as well, making things that we as a small company couldn't really access before or couldn't justify accessing, are starting to creep into our vision, our line of sight now, because of the way the market's going. Now, the downside of that is that it's not as easy to sell whiskey as maybe what it was 3 or 4 years ago, but the history of the business, the history of what whiskey has been all about is that's only temporary. And it's what you do in these times, these slightly down times or plateau times, that kind of can make or break when the times are good. So it's great to know that we are still doing the work. We're still able to invest in the business, buying the casks, buying the sherry casks, the port casks, the rum, the Armagnac casks that are going to give us that product that's going to make us stand out in the future. So yeah, hard not to get excited about what's ahead for Hannah Whisky Merchants as well. And of course, like I said, like we talked about earlier on with the 3 brands, the St. Bridget's Kirk with the Solera, these things are going to keep happening. We're going to have these ideas again, and we're going to keep being as creative as we possibly can. So pushing boundaries as much as we're allowed to as well. So who knows what's around the corner next for the business.
Well, I can say just from us, we're super excited, and we can't wait to see where you guys go in the next 5, 10, 30 years of just, creating interesting bottlings and using this Solera system and where all of that goes. So we're super excited, and we can't wait.
What excites you about independent bottling? What sort of things are you looking to see? Or what would you like an independent bottler to do as well? I think that'd be a good... Like from the US perspective.
I mean, for me, I think that, again, I mentioned it a couple of times. If I think about in my experience in whiskey and my experience of the standard American whiskey drinker, they're so rooted in bourbon. And I think that term whiskey here in America gets thrown around so much, where we say all the time, both on the podcast and off the pod, that there are so many people that say, oh, whiskey, 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 but you don't like whiskey. You like bourbon. And so many people here in the States are so hyper fixated on bourbon that they're not interested, or they're blind to kind of all the cool things that are happening in Scotch and happening within the independent bottler. So for me, what I'm interested in is bottlers like yourselves finding and kind of curating those casks that you feel are the best ones. And that it's not just this, massive distillery saying, yeah, we couldn't sell this one because maybe it doesn't fit our profile, so let's bottle it as such and such, and we'll slap a fancy label on it and call it whatever. But that an independent bottler like you guys finds something that is interesting, finds a cask of like, nope, this one's special, or does something where, again, we talked about this earlier, here's a great whiskey from a cask, and we're going to do something else with it and make that different, make it better, or maybe we need to add a little bit more age to it to make it better, but playing within that realm. And to me, that's what makes the independent bottler so interesting, is that it's not, this is what this distillery is, but here are the things that the whole profile can be explored. And that is what I find just so interesting about independent bottling. And so I hope that the future, not only for you guys, but independent bottling as a whole, is it becomes easier to do just that.
I mean, I'm really interested in bourbon and how it's sold in the US. I was actually in the US for the New Orleans Bourbon Festival in 2020. But that came to an abrupt end, and the festival got cancelled upon arrival because of COVID. But I was really keen to try all the different bourbons and things like that while I was there, because I think what's incredible about the US is that a lot of these things, just like in the UK, a lot of these things don't really cross over the Atlantic.
Right.
So you don't really know about certain distilleries, certain cask styles, because the US is pretty much its own continent, so people are just selling to other states, and that's exporting for an American distillery. So it doesn't really come over here.
Yeah,
the way that we see a lot of US casks is actually when we get bourbon barrels in their first fill, and it tends to be they'll either be Jack Daniels or Heaven Hill.
Right, and just because they're massive distilleries and they have such a surplus
totally.
they have such a surplus of cask that. But then you're gonna, here in the States, we call it craft whiskey or craft distilling, and it's just really anything that's not your big kind of 3 or 4 producers. But and I don't mean to disparage distillers here by any means, because there are some really good bourbon distilleries and really good, just we'll say American whiskey distilleries. But I think the consumer is maybe not as interested or not as willing to, okay, so if you said, here is a bourbon at 75% corn, but then we aged it in Lagavulin barrels for another year. For a lot of American consumers, they're going to say like, okay, and that unfortunately that whiskey might not sell very well, but that might be just an amazing product. But because so much of the consumer side here in America is very rigid, and I know that's a bit disparaging for the consumer, but I think that that's changing, and that's what I'm super interested in. That as that shifts, you'll see more desire for products. Yeah,
I mean, there's so much innovation in spirit distilling. I remember I was at a thing in London and I met Michael Myers, who does the 291 Colorado distillery, and he's just a really fascinating guy. His background and stuff, and the spirit that he was presenting, that he brought out his jacket pocket, I just thought, well, that's really great. And sometimes you get this opinion of whiskey that comes from the US is just Jack Daniels or something like that. And in the same way that we have to look at the US and like, how are you viewing Scotch? Are you just looking at Johnny Walker Black or Red and that's it? But as you know, there's a whole bunch of industries under that. And independent bottling is this tiny niche of the single malt market, which again is tiny compared to the blend market.
Right. I'm hopeful that you'll see from your end the changes over the next 5 or so years of the American whiskey market wanting more bespoke or more provenance to the whiskey versus, there's so much product here in terms of Tennessee whiskey or bourbon that people are, and I think, Paul, you mentioned this, like, I don't think it's a bubble that's burst. I think it's a plateau only because people are not yet aware that other things exist. And when that awareness comes in, and we see this with trends changing from, gin had a boom, vodka had a boom, whiskey's having a boom, and it is maybe tapering off. But, we see those changes and shifts in tastes. And I hope that here in America, at least, as the whiskey consumer becomes more interested in other things, that you'll see that pay off.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I just think there's so many places you could go with Scotch.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the flavors and stuff. So, and fortunately, Scotch has got really a deep portfolio of aged stock. So that's really beneficial to the industry.
Exactly.
And I'm sure the US tends to be a lot younger when it gets released. So as the industry itself in the US matures, I think the quality of spirit is going to increase substantially as well.
Yeah.
And when they start using refill casks, although it's going to make the price of Scotch increase, it's going to be really interesting to see what that's going to do to bourbons and all the different sour mashes and all those different styles of whiskey, and how they're going to react to further oxidation in time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Here in the States, when you say, a 7-year bourbon, that's a pretty old bourbon. I mean, obviously we have bourbons that are into the 20s, but in Scotch, a 7-year Scotch is a very young Scotch still in the kind of the grand pantheon of things. I mean, there are easily Scotches that are, pushing 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And I recognize those are more rare, but still, yeah, definitely. And I think, again, it goes back to, is age a marker of quality? In some cases, sure. But in other cases, it's all about that, ultimately what that distillate has done within that barrel and how that presents itself.
I mean, without getting too much into the technicalities, we've used virgin oak, which is predominantly what's used for a lot of bourbons. And I tend to find that they apply too much of a finish and gingery quality to it. So, and also it masks a lot of undesirable traits because the cask is so strong. So we've done a couple of virgin oak finishes, which have maybe been a 3-month or 6-month finish in virgin oak for a 10-year-old spirit. And it really fundamentally changes the spirit to such a point where it's maybe not that great. So I think it'd be interesting to see what it does when the US industry is not having to use virgin oak or first fill casks, and see if the spirit quality is being hidden, but more to see, well, what can we see when we open the hood a little bit more and get more of these congeners and see what reactions we can get.
Yeah, what is that development, and how does that reshape the ultimate spirit as a whole?
100%. I think it'll be good to get some well matured refill hogsheads of bourbon stuff, and it can only the knowledge is all there, so it's not like it's all secret now.
Right.
I mean, when I did my master's in brewing and distilling, there was loads of students from the US there, so there's all this knowledge is being shared. I think there's quite a lot of courses in the US which are doing distilling to high levels.
Yeah. Well, and I think to that point too, like you see, obviously Scotland, Ireland, and other parts, Taiwan, Australia, get a lot of used casks, barrels from here in the States, just because we make so much. But I've noticed, and I don't know if you've seen this, but the transit back of where, again, here's a cask that was used from such and such distillery for, 10 years. And now we've gotten that cask back, or we've gotten those staves back and we've reformed it. Now here's something else. And I think that's going to be an interesting process too, of what happens when there's a reciprocity back across the ocean, and how does that work?
From our perspective, we've just started reusing casks a lot more. We'll actually, rather than just buying a cask and maybe, using it and then refilling it and then maybe getting a third fill, we'll actually just get it recharred at the cooperage.
Right.
So we recooper and reassemble and rechar. And so it's just removing a layer of the inside of the oak. So you're getting a lot more for your money, and it's better than these casks just being used for flower pots, because there's a hell of a lot more vanillins and sugars in them. So I'm not really sure about casks going back to the US, but I imagine, you've got like Beam and all these companies who have got a really closed circle in terms of where all their casks are going. So it wouldn't surprise me if they come out of Jack Daniels, go into Scotch, and then they get deconstructed and then sent back to the US. Because, you need to look after the assets. Sorry, I feel like I could bore the back hitting legs off a donkey, but yeah, I could go on about I've got a lot of respect for bourbon, and I'm excited to see what reusing casks is going to do for the industry.
Listen, I don't find it, and I know our listeners don't find it boring at all. This is the stuff that we nerd out about. Paul mentioned that whiskey geek at heart, and that's what a lot of the Drep and Stone listeners are. It's that kind of thing of like, well, what happens if you do this, or what if we do this, or why isn't this a thing? And I think that's what makes ultimately, that's what separates just someone, putting back drams and someone who's really interested in the whiskey as a whole. And I think that's what we promote, that kind of mindfulness thought process of what goes into it, and how, what is the nerdy aspects of it. So I love it. I love it.
Well, just with that, with regards to thinking out your products and innovation, before Paul started with the business, I used to enter this competition in Scotland for like the Independent Bottler of the Year, and I would always lose. And I would tend to do like 15 single cask releases a year, and I'd spend quite a lot of money getting the casks and deciding what to do with them and stuff. But then you would have other independent bottlers that could essentially release hundreds of casks a year, and they would almost drown the judges in the amount of samples you've got. And you're sort of throwing so many darts against the wall that if one of them hits a bullseye, then that's it. And what I'm getting at is, Paul and I and Gavin and Alex, when we're selecting casks, we're selecting from a really limited pool, but we're selecting stuff that we personally really rate and we enjoy. And I think that's a difference between a lot of other sort of bigger bottlers, maybe, where there's just so much getting released onto the market. You wonder where the quality control is. And I would hate for that to happen in the US if there was like a proliferation of independents.
I do. I'm still here, guys. Just letting Gregor do his American whiskey thing. No, just on that point of what Gregor mentioned, we as a business are very small, and as much as we would, I'm sure Gregor would agree, love to grow, and have Ferraris as company cars and things like that. We're at just such a great little point right now where we don't have the pressure that the bigger companies, the bigger independent bottlers have to just tick boxes to get liquid into market, into glass. And, I've seen it firsthand. And again, I'm not going to name names, but having worked for, companies before where the need to fill a 10-year-old Speyside for, Taiwan or the Asian market in general, the cask would just be bottled without even passing anyone's lips before it hit the glass and hit the palate and went out to market. So, that's a necessity. I'm not blaming them, but we don't have that. We can go into the warehouse, as Gregor mentioned. The four of us do. Even Gavin and Alex as well. We take our glasses, we take the bung hammer, the Valinch, and we go in and we spend a day just trying casks. And most of them we say, not yet, not today, but maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year. But that's what we do, and most get rejected at the end of the day, and we can be that selective, and it's a nice place to be. It's a nice place to be that selective right now, and long may it continue within the best frame that we can have, because it keeps the quality high, and there's never been a point where we've bottled anything for the sake of it, and that we've ever looked back on and thought, maybe we'd, with this head on now, we would have made a different decision. So we'll see. Well, hopefully that can continue, but we can still have our Ferraris as well at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, Paul and Gregor, thank you so much for coming to talk with us, and we wish you the best, and we can't wait to see what happens for you guys in the future.
Yeah, likewise. It's been a pleasure being able to share our stories, share the vision that we have, and hopefully you'll find our products out in the market soon.
Thanks very much for having us on.